Good afternoon, everybody, or evening, as the case may be. I'm Amy Scott. I'm the Executive Vice President of Research and Interpretation, as well as the Marilyn B and Calvin B. Gross Curator at the Autry Museum of the American West. First, I'd like to begin by thanking all of our trustees and members who made this series possible, and for the opportunity to share with you the work of a truly extraordinary artist. So on behalf of the Autry trustees and staff, welcome to the Autry Artist Salons. Joining me today from his beautiful studio in Santa Fe, New Mexico will be Michael Scott momentarily. Michael began exhibiting his work in the late 1970s and has since shown extensively throughout the Midwest, on the East Coast, and in New York, where he spent some of his formative years as a young artist, as well as Santa Fe and other museums across the West, including one of my personal favorites, the notable Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is currently exhibiting some, but not all, of the very works that we'll be talking about here. He's also shown, of course, in Los Angeles at the Autry Museum of the American West last year with some of the works from his Fire series, a landscape series that I think comprises really some of his most exciting and interesting work yet. And that is saying a great deal. I personally have known Michael for over 20 years, having encountered him first through his Little Red Hen series at the Gerald Peters Gallery in Santa Fe back in the late 1990s. We struck up a correspondence that has continued ever since. And one of the reasons for that, I think, has to do with Michael's deep intellectual involvement with some of the questions posed by art history. Major questions, such as the nature of painting versus reality, the landscape as an object versus a metaphor, and the stories that art tells through symbols. He also has a deep and abiding love of the American West and of Western art, evidenced in previous series of his, such as the Buffalo Bulbs, a play on words that combined iconography from Wild West show propaganda with references to still life and the tulip craze in 17th century Holland to speak to matters of representation and artistic versus market value. He followed that up not long after with the Farney Fables, a winding narrative in which characters from the work of the turn of the century frontier artist Henry Farney help guide the viewer through a conversation about truth and beauty in art. Now, importantly, unlike many artists who stick to figuration or abstraction, portraiture, or narrative, Michael is more of a Renaissance man. And today we're going to be looking at, again, what I really think is some of the very best work he's yet produced, which is all about the landscape. From grand paintings that evoke the sublime of Western wilderness to matters of ecological transformation and even climate change, Michael consistently applies his unique intellect and deep knowledge of our history to his landscapes, which, as we'll see, pay homage to history while speaking directly to environmental issues that matter today. If you have questions during our conversation, please enter them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll be sure to share some time to go through those after our conversation. As many of you also know, of course, the Autry Museum represents something different to each and every one of our visitors who come to us physically and these days virtually. And for me, these personal connections and the many portals through which they're created is one of our defining strengths of this institution. So with no further ado, welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us today.
There we go.
Excellent. Hi, my friend. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Good. Well, thank you again for doing this. I wish I could be there in person. I love our studio visits and our chats, but hopefully this will be about the next best thing. Rob, if you could pull up the first slide, please. So I thought, as by way of an introduction to Michael and how he thinks, that we would show this relatively early work, which he calls The Wanderer, painted in 1985, alongside Caspar David Friedrich's famous painting, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, painted in 1818. And this is a relatively early work for Michael, which importantly, he has never shown. So you're getting a real treat here today. And it depicts the artist as an explorer in the grand tradition of 19th century exploration and naturalism as defined by Friedrich's painting. Friedrich's painting is also thought to have been a portrait of the artist, and it depicts him on this literal precipice of visual discovery, overlooking a vast landscape which is yet unseen as it's hidden amongst the clouds. So Michael's work, taking some cues from Friedrich, interestingly, was painted at a time in the mid-'80s, long before realism and narrative art returned to prominence within the art world, when abstraction and pop were still the sort of genres that were considered to be important. And so this painting really confronts history, it confronts art history, at a time when some of the very issues that its predecessor takes up were considered to be passé. So Michael, I thought we would start by talking a little bit about why you chose this painting, the Friedrich painting, to model yourself and your sort of artistic self-image on at this point in career, and what that says about your approach to the environment, to landscape, and to painting.
Well, first off, the reason why the painting's never been shown is I pretty much feel it was a ridiculous painting. And but sometimes you have to do ridiculous paintings just to kind of get them out of your crawl. And it was a idea, that a concept that I wanted to explore and have explored since, and that is the artist as a wanderer. That's obvious, and then making reference to the Friedrich, but also this kind of moment that occurs in the landscape when you view the moon or the sun. You have this temporal collision. So there's the temporal moment, and then you have this iconic symbol of the circle. If you look at Jungian psychology, the archetype of the circle, and certainly representing eternity. And so, there you go. You have those two things colliding, and then of course out there on the rocks, being, I did feel in many ways I was attracted to romanticism, but at the same time it was very much out of favor. And so you're out there in the big ocean, very insecure, I suppose, because I was a pretty young painter at this period, and I think that the wonder idea that has continued, though. That is the artist process that I'm fascinated to continue with, and that's pretty much it for that piece. I mean, Friedrich being a hero of mine, and we look at him later in this discussion, but I was very attracted to this Sublime, and almost, I would say, over half of his inventory of works deal with the Sublime. And so, as a landscape artist, that's certainly, that's a fascinating subject to deal with.
So let's delve into this idea of the Sublime just a little bit more, because I think this recurs throughout your landscape work especially, and is one of sort of really many important art historical concepts and ideas that you seem to like to return to. So the Sublime is defined by historic art, and Friedrich, foremost among them, is the idea that the landscape is itself a force that is within our reach, but also beyond our control. So it has an overwhelming sensation, often created through immense natural beauty and grandeur, But that overwhelming sensation itself becomes a metaphor in the historical sublime for the relationship between man and God, right? Friedrich's self-portrait is very much of himself in the heavens. You, however, I think interestingly, are on the rocks in the sea. And perhaps even more so because they're choppy, there are these waves, they're very jagged. Even more so than Friedrich, speaks to this element of risk, which is a big component of approaching that line between man and God in art, between man and God in nature, as well as, of course, the artistic risks that you have to take as an artist, and especially as a young artist working in a genre that is not fashionable at the time.
Yeah, it's risky business. There's no question about it. Kind of a funny little sidebar about this painting. I had done this painting, and I had it. It was something I worked on primarily influenced out of Church's Acadia painting, and I just loved that piece. But every summer we would be on Monhegan Island, and I would allow the boys to invite one friend, and so this particular summer, a young fellow, Max's buddy, his age, he was around 12 or 13 years old, Matt Erland came, and so we were on island, getting ready for dinner, and Matt was nowhere to be found, and so I sent the boys out to go find him, and they came back a few minutes later, and they said, "Dad, you have to come with us. He's out on the rocks." And so Matt had seen this painting. I mean, I know he had encountered it in the studio before we went to the island, and so there's Matt out there, and all I can think of, well, he's going to drown, and I'm going to have to call his dad and say, "I'm sorry, Ken, we lost Matt to the rocks." And so that, unfortunately, we did convince him to jump, and we caught him, and he was able to get back. But he, to this day, is a wanderer. And so, I found the whole idea of this painting and his whole life to be kind of like a oddity. And so I suppose that's one element that actually increases life's risk, if you go and test out these theories. But anyway, he's safe and sound, and so, that's probably enough said about that piece.
Well, that's certainly good news. And it turned out okay. Rob, if we can move to the next slide, please. All right, this painting or this pairing, I thought, now that we have a sense of sort of who you are and who your artistic heroes are and your ambitions when it comes to landscape, that we could talk a little bit about your process. So the painting on the left is called Summer Solstice. You painted it in Washington State between 2016 to 19. So a 3-year period of development, which is actually not uncommon for you. And it's basically an outdoor studio as well as a landscape in which the easel and the paints in the foreground invite the viewer, or are inviting the viewer in to participate as if they were the artist. So it's basically an invitation to create, it's an invitation to view, to see the land through your eyes. But what is so that's a conceptual sort of play within itself. But what I find as interesting is that what is being painted in the little painting on the easel, which is this ghostly white deer, is not visible in the scene itself. So basically it's a painting of a painting that does not correspond to the artist's or the viewer's experience of that painting. So what's going on there?
Yeah, the process that, I think it's important for people to understand the process, which is I do these small field paintings on site, and they're in effect my memory and my experience of the place. Actually, I have a couple of them here. Show you what they look like. This is one from Coos Bay, a little ocean painting. This is one. This is one really gets at the experience. There was a storm. This is up in the Boundary Waters last summer, and canoeing. The storm comes up. The waves, push you ashore, and so at that time I thought, well, rather than stop and unpack, I would make a painting about the canoe being pushed up. And so that process is usually, sometimes the quickest I've ever done a painting was probably 5 minutes. I was up in Canada, and it was black fly season. The title of the painting was "The Attack of the Black Flies." I was completely surrounded, and so my rag and my brush was all one at that moment. And you use the rag in this process of making these small paintings as much as you do the brush. And really, you're dealing with two different variables simultaneously, which is object-based painting and then ground-based painting. And so the object-based operates to a point. So you're wandering in the woods, and you all of a sudden there's something that stops you. You have this experience that says, okay, stop here and let's check this out. So it seems interesting enough. You start working, setting up your easel, etc. But then you have to leave that. That's a conscious choice of that stopping. And then you leave that process once you enter into the painting, and it becomes ground-based. And I'm sorry if this sounds a little bit too abstract, but I'll try to explain it thoroughly, where the ground base is making the mark. So the first mark on the panel is now responding to the place, and the second mark then informs the next mark. And so that informing mark after mark is it comes out of abstract expressionism, I would say, more than anything else, and you are a participant with just mark making, and which is void of the place and void of the object. And then you return to the object, refer to the imagery that you're actually dealing with, which is a certain mapping of the place. And those marks then, over time of working on the painting, actually add up to the place. And so that's the memory. And that particular memory then offers meaning. And then once you come back into the studio and you have this image that you say, well, I'm going to develop this. I'm going to take this a bit further, then that meaning then enters into the dialogue with the painting. And so the original study for this particular place, the summer solstice there up in Washington State around La Push, does not contain the easel, does not contain the ghost ear, does not contain the antlers on the easel. So the branches, at some point after a year and a half of working on this painting, then kind of revealed that the easel had become this deer, and then, okay, was the deer imagined or was it real? And so sometimes in the field, your imagination and your own histories actually dictate an occurrence. And so the memory of what happens in the rainforest is, it's a pretty dense place. There's a lot of, in some ways, kind of a frightening place, because there's so much density to it, and then you have to convey that, or you try to convey that in larger work. So the trees going back in the larger piece, going back into the larger painting, the trees become very figurative and almost like dancers, if you will. And so it's this interaction between the deer, quote unquote, but also offering the viewer the experience of making a painting. So this is how it works. I mean, this is basically the process. Things come, they go. Sometimes they enter, they disappear, etc. And so it's not as if I'm not a painter that does an A, B, C, D, and then it's done. I mean, there's a lot of migration in the work, and a lot of drifting. Sometimes the paintings are destroyed out of the process, and we try not to do that, but it happens. Like this is like, well, sorry, I didn't mean to destroy you, but you got destroyed.
Oops. Rob, can we pull that slide up back just one quick minute? Because I wanted to look at this idea of the branches as dancers, and that there's a rhythm and a timing and a sense of sort of movement that is choreographed throughout the painting. But of course, it's done that through your memory and sort of your unconscious as much as the experience within the landscape itself, which would have been very, very brief compared to the amount of time, 3-some years that you actually spent working on the canvas. And so there's this animated, anthropomorphized quality to the landscape that comes not only from the rhythm of the branches kind of dancing around in the foreground, the more static branches in the middle to background, of course, the antlers, and then the emergence of the deer kind of mysteriously out of the canvas itself. But it has a personality to it that, like most people, is difficult to really understand or thoroughly know. And it also has an imaginative, almost sort of supernatural quality, I think, that makes it a little teeny bit scary. And with that, speaking of the supernatural, I thought we could look at one of the most surreal works that I have seen ever from you. If you can go to the next slide. So this is called Titan's Cup on Fire. And it's a work that you began earlier this year.
Right, I'm still working on it.
It's still in progress, right? So again, another treat. This painting, by the time it makes it out of the studio, will probably look quite differently. So Michael's process, though, is part of his work, and you can see the ways in which sort of the strokes and the colors, I think, get layered upon one another, especially in the intensity and the heat of this fire emanating mysteriously from this giant cup in what appears to be the middle of Yosemite. So actually, if we can go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about these symbols and some of the sources. So as you can see, Michael's Titan's Cup then is a composite landscape that combines two other also famous composite landscapes from American art history, which is Albert Bierstadt's Domes of Yosemite on the left from 1864, and of course Thomas Cole's Titan's Goblet from 1833, which is at the Met. And so there's a lot going on here, clearly, but let's start with kind of the art historical lineage. Bierstadt was one of the most influential painters, of course, of the American West and of the Western landscape, especially by the end of the 19th century. And he was, I think, really importantly, a student of Thomas Cole's, who was perhaps the best known landscape painter prior to the westward migration, known for his studies in Italy and from his borrowing from classical narratives in order to create metaphors for the transformation of nature, especially cautionary tales on the downfall of society. Those of you who know his famous Course of Empire series, for example. So together, they really speak to the significance of the landscape at these two formative moments in American and in Western history, the Jacksonian era of Thomas Cole, who is eager to launch westward expansion, simultaneously clearing it, I think, of Native peoples. And then Bierstadt is really an artist of the post-Civil War era and of Reconstruction, during which people are looking to the Western landscape for a sense of renewal following and recovery and sort of spiritual regeneration, if you will, following this absolutely devastating, incredibly divisive and bloody conflict. So the Cole, on the one hand, from the era of Jacksonian sort of pre-expansion, and then the Bierstadt looking to recover from some of the consequences of the conflict that expansion ignited in a literal sense. And there's your piece right in the middle of the two of them.
Yeah, so, let's talk about Cole here for a second.
Yeah.
Because it helps, I think, gives the viewer a little bit of history and background. Why, because the cup painting, or the goblet, is probably the most obscure of all of his paintings. And very art historians for years have not been
Such a weird painting.
Yeah, and it's very undefined in that regard. But you see these little sailboats and things in the goblet, you know, and previous to him making this particular painting, he had gone to Rome. He was influenced by Claude Lorrain, and who was basically a painter of the ideal landscape. He's probably the model for that. And then, but Cole's interest there was not so much in the ideal landscape, but he was painting the Roman and Greek ruins. And so if you take the goblet, out of that context of how he would have then put this, but viewing nature as a never-ending source of abundance, and in this particular painting, and it would always overflow, you know, the whole idea regarding that. And it would be very different from two other artists that he was influenced by, both J.W. Turner and John Martin, who had created these kind of apocalyptic imagery and then influenced, like you say, the course of empires. And so my interpretation is that, well, it's no longer the cup overfloweth, but it's the heating of the planet, and the ideal or the idealistic landscape is no longer, because of the intrusion of man, which gets a little bit closer to how Bierstadt would have portrayed, although Bierstadt and Church, they both portrayed the human in very small form, as well as Cole. And so God and the landscape were far greater, but yet over time, and certainly in today's world, we as humans are viewing ourselves as the ruler over land, and that is we're paying consequence, you know, for that particular idea, which pretty much came out of Manifest Destiny, which is, I think, it was a false model for expansionism.
So in this, by substituting the sort of the placid lake that is in the cup in the Cole painting with this really, sort of bright inferno at the center of the painting, which then of course contrasts off of the, sort of jumps out from the background that is the Bierstadt painted in these blues, orange and blue being oppositional colors on the color wheel. You also have the idea of fire and water as oppositional elements within nature. And I wondered if you can talk maybe a little bit about that, how you see, because of course water figures heavily into your paintings as well. How is you see these elements, sort of working together, playing off one another, and what the symbolism of each is relative to the other?
Well, I mean, they are opposites, and I pretty much in the last 5 or 6 years been focusing mainly on the element of fire. I'm now very much involved in the element of water. This painting, this large piece back here, this 9-foot painting is about a tsunami and what occurs out of that experience, placing the viewer in the water, drowning, and a very, very happy moment for the viewer to experience. And so you have these opposites, and both rising, even though the water's falling. Water does contain mist. It's the most, of all of the elements, it's the most fugitive, because it can shift and change from mist to, the springs that bubble up fresh water into the streams that then go into our rivers and then go into our oceans, et cetera, et cetera. And then it can freeze. And so then you have that component, and then it is lighter than the water that contains it. And so it floats. So it's a really mysterious and magical, just like fire in its own way. I mean, they both are fascinating in that regard. There's so many, I mean, we're about water, and we're, but we're also about fire. And there's so much of our beings that deal with fire. When you drink whiskey, you're drinking fire water. When you cook over coals, you're tasting the fire, et cetera. And so, there's even references. Sexuality is attached to fire. When it's a really great romance, then it's on fire, and then when it cools down, then it goes into this kind of black coal that just sits there and festers. And so, it's part of our psyche, and very, very, very old in terms of our being.
So speaking, that's one of the things that I really love about your landscape work, is they are not, unlike the 19th century, and unlike Albert Bierstadt, who really sort of saw nature as an object to behold, a timeless object. Your work really is about change and transformation, and the role of some of these elements, whether water or fire, as both a destructive and a regenerative process, which brings me to this next pair of images. And so these are, I think, a couple of the more really sort of mysterious paintings. And I wanted to show your Bitterroot. Let's see, Messenger of the Bitterroot is the title of the painting, painted between 2017 and 2020, so finished just this year, alongside another famous work by Caspar David Friedrich, which is Abbey in the Oak Woods of 1810. And importantly, the Friedrich painting is not your, Bob Ross Happy Trees landscape, right? It is.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, I don't see Bob Ross as a source for you for whatever reason. But the Friedrich, paintings that they're dead, and they're sort of they're twisted in death, almost kind of like how limbs go in rigor mortis. The landscape is a cemetery. You see crosses and gravestones. And the building, the Abbey itself, is of course a ruin. There's only the facade left. But more important or interesting in the Friedrich painting is not all of the symbols and elements of death within nature of the church, but the idea of what remains after that death. it's a ghost. And with, like any ghost or ghostly element, which is basically in its essence what is left behind by the physical death of nature, of a being, of the body, there's a great deal of mystery to that. And so then the church becomes less of a static object than a gateway or a passage into another unseen part of the landscape, perhaps an otherworldly realm. So there's a supernatural quality to the church, which is part of the reason, I think a major part of the reason why it's such a resonant and studied image throughout our history. And then looking at your work alongside that, what separates, what both I think ties it to and distinguishes it from the Friedrich is sort of the destructive quality to it, clearly the dead trees, but you have included this fire, which is an animating force. And I wondered if you might speak a little bit about the role of fire as a metaphor, both for death and for the spirituality that comes with the transition from one world to another, or kind of the supernatural quality that fire, seems to embody for so many of us.
Well, first I'll talk briefly about the Friedrich in my interpretation of that painting. Obviously, it's not a church that is full, or an abbey that is constructed and not in ruins. It's flanked by both trees, which show their history in terms of their life cycle, and so you enter through that entry into you're traveling through the landscape, and you're entering back into the landscape. In my opinion, Friedrich is viewing the planet, or the earth, the landscape, if you will, in the same capacity as any structure that man makes to worship it. And so that to me is very important in that piece, because it does provide this kind of renewal of this phenomena that the landscape offers the participant. In the owl painting, you have 4 elements of fire within that particular piece. Of the Bitterroot, you have the sun, of course, which is fire, and it is what has helped us stay, alive. It's of course being attacked through the ozone and carbon, and then the amount of carbon that's being released in the atmosphere is referred to by the fire itself that's being ignited there. So again, it references the global warming of the planet. You have this owl emerging, the snowy owl, representing the phoenix bird rising out of the fire for renewal. So like the Friedrich, it addresses the life cycle of things. And then you have the smoke itself, which is in effect an hourglass, which contains all of those elements and looks at the total time, the 4 billion years that the planet has been in existence and has been forming, and how we grew up. And we've had, within that 4 billion years, within the last 50 years, have altered it drastically. And so that's the conversation that's in this piece. And it's not a happy conversation, but it's still a conversation that's very important to listen to.
I like the idea also of bringing the bird into it as it's an animal, of course, but it's also an aspect of fire and its associations with the phoenix and the idea of rising from the ashes. And this bird you know, sort of literally rising out of this smoldering pile of trees into this hourglass shape that the smoke has become, which then, of course, speaks to time. So let's go to another fire owl painting, which is the next slide. It is also the landscape that I am in. And I put it alongside here another painting by Bierstadt, which is his Giant Redwoods of California from 1874. And the reason I did this is not just because of the compositional similarities and the vertical format, and obviously the use of trees to sort of define and establish that rhythm within the picture. Also, there is this sort of warm light and glow that emanates from the center of them. But they are otherwise two really incredibly different images. And the Bierstadt, in part, it's 1874, right? So it's from the era of Reconstruction when we are looking to the West and its wilderness landscapes, Yosemite and Yellowstone in particular, as a means of spiritual healing. This idea that God had christened the American West and the far West, especially California, the Golden State, as nature's cathedral, was interpreted as a sign of not only our God-given right to expand westward, but in the process to reclaim ourselves, to reclaim salvation, following this wrath of the Civil War, which many believed was punishment from God for a nation that had slipped into moral decay and materialism. So there is a very significant spiritual quality to the Bierstadt as Americans are looking to redeem themselves as sort of the chosen people, if you will, in the context of westward expansion. As well as this idea of revitalization. The landscape is a place and a source of sort of cultural as well as personal revitalization. And then, of course, in your painting, you have, again, this owl that is rising out of the center of the painting, which has been changed from a lake, from water, into this smoldering fire that rises in this otherwise sort of inexplicably snowy land. So there's that contrast or oppositional nature also, the idea of fire and heat emanating spontaneously or mysteriously from within an otherwise very sort of cold place. And then the owl itself, who is of course transparent, speaks, I think, to, I'm not sure what, sort of the ritualistic nature of our getting into nature, of the human desire to transport ourselves back into nature, and of how we keep returning to nature in order to redeem ourselves.
Well, the bird, I think, or birds, and I view these as encounters. When I encounter them, there's meaning attached to them, and so that's part of the investigation that some of these paintings actually migrate to. Is when you have a bird encounter that comes across your path, then in the case of, or certainly the owl is referred to in Jungian psychology as the messenger. And so there's a message there that one has to interpret. It is usually very obscure. It's not something that, it reveals itself easily. It is something that you need to pay attention to as a question. This particular painting of the owl is, I think, again, a phoenix, but also representing a rebirth. that the landscape renews you by, and that's what I get from the Bierstadt, is that when we participate in the natural world and when we go and we isolate ourselves there and we have this kind of communion, that it feeds us in such miraculous ways, and so in that way, your being is reborn, and you have new awarenesses of your place in and the role of on the planet, and it's a reminder of sorts that that one should be in those places and participate, and it will the density of it gives you, I think, a stronger life, and also huge awarenesses about your place and time. And because I think as an artist, I mean, if you're not painting paintings that are somewhat challenging with concepts, then I wonder, why are you making paintings? And I ask myself that question quite often. Does this painting need to exist? You know, and so if I can't if I can't explain that to myself, or I can't give an answer, then I keep looking for its explanation. And so I do have this theory that paintings have their own embedded ambitions, and that in the same way you pay attention to the metaphor of the owl, you also have this dialogue with the piece that you have to pay attention to as well, because it is talking to you, and the greatest danger is that you do not want to tell it what it has to be, that you need to listen to it and what it wants to be or needs to be in terms of the conversation. And so it's a very different approach, and I think that that same approach, if you were wandering through that Bierstadt landscape, would be the same approach I would have amongst the redwoods, you know, and it's a lot better to ask the questions than it is to tell.
That reminds me of this essay by the art historian W.J.T. Mitchell, I think is his name, called "What Do Pictures Want?", in which he explores the way that pictures, you know, sometimes demand, sometimes more quietly, you know, things from us that create this relationship that we have with them. And they do that in explicit and interesting ways. So with that in mind, what do pictures want? I think that's probably a good time to take some questions from the audience. If you want to enter them into your Q&A feature, I'm going to turn it on and I will read them out for Michael.
Before we go there, let me say this, Amy. I think that oftentimes viewers, when they go to a museum or they go to a gallery, they look at works of art in referencing it as I like it or I don't like it, or it's a good piece or it's not a good piece. And I think that's the wrong question. The question you should be asking when you look at a work of art is it magic? And so if it's magical, and if it contains that element of magic that transports you, then that's something to participate in and judge it out of that kind of characteristic.
Well, your paintings are definitely magical. There's no question about that. So the first question that we have has to do with the artists or locations in nature that you find most inspiring.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is it like a location that I've been to?
Yeah, I think it is, if I'm interpreting it correctly. I think it's just, it says, what artists or locations in nature do you find most inspiring? So I think it's talking about specific places. We've talked a lot about Bierstadt and Cole and Friedrich, of course, but perhaps you could talk about a few others.
Yeah, I mean, I painted primarily, I like northern regions more than I do like southern regions. And I also like landscapes that have verticals as opposed to horizontal.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's rhythms involved in that spatial relationship that I like to compositionally operate from. And so that could be anywhere, basically, as long as it's got good good trees,
Mm-hmm.
good mountains, I suppose. Yes, good clouds. And so we don't have a lot of verticals here in New Mexico in the Galisteo Basin, but you certainly can be in the mountains and acquire them quite rapidly. So it is, you know, I enjoy Maine a great deal. That's probably a real deep well for me as far as what it offers as a landscape. And the moodiness of the coast and the granite there is quite
Mm-hmm.
quite beautiful. But you get that in Washington State too. You get these big outcroppings and other mysterious along the coast of Oregon, down into California with the redwoods. And so, you know, there are as a landscape painter, you know, I've covered them all. I tend to feel my trip to the Everglades was my least um, safe place because I thought I was going to be bitten by a cottonmouth or so I didn't particularly care for that. And I also like Mohegan Island a great deal because I don't have to worry about a bear or anything like that. And so, you know, there are certain things you have to be kind of attuned to when you place yourself in certain landscapes.
Mm-hmm. So it's really sort of about the various aspects that a landscape contains. Here's another question. As this landscape series has evolved from the initial concept 3 to 4 years ago, how has this artistic journey changed your views of what you began and how it evolved to the present finished painting? From JJ Sanitato in Maryland.
Well, this project's been going on just shy of 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it grew out of a heart event that I had to kind of like pay attention to. And so when you have those kind of events physically in your life, you get really aware and in touch with your own mortality as far as what makes you happy, what amount of time you have, and then within that time frame, what is it that you want to do with it? And so I had initiated my career as a painter with the landscape. I set it aside. The paintings in New York that I was showing back in the 80s and 90s primarily they were environmental paintings. And but the temperament and the attitude at the time was much more difficult for the conversation. People were still wanting to be involved in a more pleasant landscape, if you will, and mine were not. And so that actually went through a certain migration, and I ended up changing and doing these conceptual projects about these other ideas. But after this event, that doesn't interest me as much, and I like the landscape more than anything in my life. I feel very connected to it, and so I returned to that same conversation. The difference is today that I offer, and rather than it's just slash and burn, clear cut, and destruction, I offer a conversation as for the spiritual aspect of how we're fed as humans and how important that is not to rob ourselves of that experience and take the last vestiges of wilderness away from ourselves. And I refer to, you know, the north kind of encroachment that we're now doing.
Well, speaking of, wilderness and the ruination thereof, this is a really interesting question. Given the increasing devastation of fire season, which of course here in California is currently raging, there are no less than 1 million, if not more, acres literally on fire as we speak. What questions do you think are important for us to ask about our interactions with the natural world?
Well, I mean, it's clear that there's a demand for it because the national parks have never been crowded, more overrun. Their budgets have been severely cut, and it's hard for them to maintain. But so the drive is there. How you participate in that, it comes to, I think, stewardship and you know, being involved in taking care of our planet. I think that's a real lesson. 90% of wildfires are created by human interaction and human beings. I mean, you have a great deal of them certainly in California this year that were lightning struck. But you know, if you're heating the planet, these fires are going to be far more intense as we're seeing. The same is occurring with water. The floods are a great deal more severe. The tornadoes are more, the tsunamis and the hurricanes are more regular. And so, you know, it is a planet out of balance. And so I think stewardship and awareness and participating in that kind of conservation, that's where we have to be. I mean, I know it sounds like I'm on a soapbox, but I really believe, and I feel as an artist, that's part of my duty to be involved in that conversation.
Okay, the next question also has a contemporary and environmental component to it, which is what inspiration, if any, have you found during the pandemic that might influence your current or future work?
Well, my day really doesn't change too much. I mean, the pandemic might, I mean, I pretty much live in isolation with my wife and my dogs, and that I don't go someplace else. My studio is on the compound here that I created. So that part of it is the same. I think the awareness of how this pandemic and probably others to follow are created. It is when you go into the rainforest and you start taking out species and you start cutting it down and then you are heating things, etc. And you know, the species that lives in those places, they've been pretty much contained and isolated. But then you put them into these other environments where diseases then jump from one species to the next species and then to human. And we've never encountered it before. It's only lived out there, with bat droppings or some kind of animal that is sold in these wet, markets. And that's an awareness that you have to pay attention to. That's also saying, hey, be aware and stop taking away the natural habitat for things that you shouldn't be fooling with. And so it becomes a habitat question. Whether I make a painting about that, I don't know. I haven't yet, but I'm certainly aware and involved in the conversation.
But it definitely, that's an interesting answer, in that it definitely gets back to, your work does speak to some of the ramifications of not respecting the environment, of the unintended consequences of altering it too drastically. And of course, the pandemic is an extremely, sort of extreme and terrifying example of that. Okay, I think we have quick time for one more question. How do you see your artwork reflecting the current times we are in, again, with the fires across the West?
Well, again, the fires across the West that's one element that's going on, but you're also, opening up the Arctic for drilling. I mean, this idea of short-term gain out of greed for a few, robbing many, and the planet of protection. I mean, we really haven't even gotten into the permafrost and the thawing of that, and millions of years of carbon embedded in that. That's up in Greenland. I mean, that is that's going to have some real effects that is not going to be terribly pleasant. I mean, the Earth will go on. I mean, but species will change and be oblivious.
Yeah. Our existence within it might not, if we're not a little more conscious of these things. Thank you for joining us today, Michael, for taking the time to talk with me. And thanks to everybody out there who took time out of your busy days to hear more about Michael and his work and learn a little bit about our association and, of course, the Autry. I hope that you will join me again for another conversation on Saturday, September 26th. With the artist and sculptor Gerald Clark from his ranch on the Cahuilla Band of Indians Reservation. And I thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening.